Hello, friend. You're welcome to this discussion on principles of economics. Lecture 4 discusses basic macroeconomic concepts. And we're going to be looking at four of them here. Number one is growth, number two is business cycle, number three is unemployment, and number four, which is the last one, is inflation and deflation. So let's get to growth. In studies of economics, growth looks at the factors which explain economic growth. It explains economic growth such as the increase in the output per capita. Increase in the output per capita, all right, of a country over a period of time. Economic growth basically is an increase in the production of economic goods and services in one period of time compared with a previous period. So you can't talk about economic growth without comparing two different periods, like last year and this year. So you check what was produced last year, reflect it, and compare with what is produced this year. That tells you whether there is growth or otherwise. So growth generally refers to an increase in aggregate production in an economy, which generally manifests as a rise in national income. Given that it is a macroeconomic concept here, it has to do with the aggregate economy, and that is why it often manifests as a rise in national income. It can be measured either in nominal or real terms. Of course, real terms is a situation where you have taken care of the fluctuation caused by inflation. Traditionally, aggregate economic growth is measured in terms of gross national product, NGNP, or gross domestic product, GDP. So that's all about economic growth as a concept. Now let's look at business cycle. Of course, when you see cycle, what quickly comes to mind is bicycle. Bicycle is all about pedaling up and down, and then it makes that ring to keep moving, the wheel to keep moving. So this theory actually started after the Great Depression of the 1930s. A business cycle describes the fluctuations in an economy over a period of time. Of course, often it's like 1 year. A fluctuation over a period of time. Generally, the period from the start of one recession to the start of another recession. Okay, so a recession is when economy, generally speaking, is when economy is not doing well. Okay, so is calculated from generally from the time, the end of one recession to the end of another, to the beginning of another recession. Business cycle models show how national real GDP fluctuates over time, going through phases of aggregate output increase and decrease. Okay, so business cycle describes the regular fluctuation in economic performance of an economy. Just like we have this graph here, let's assume the economy is kicking off here. Here is doing very well, and then it moves down up to this point is not doing well. This could be like a recession period. Okay, and then it takes off here and started doing well up to the point where it enters another recession. So from this point where it's starting another recession to a point where it ends the other recession is called a cycle. Okay, now the other concept of interest is unemployment. Unemployment is when an individual who is not employed, remember, he's not employed, and is seeking for employment cannot find work. It is the proportion of people above a specific age, usually adults, depending on how the country has defined who an adult, a working class person is. So it's the proportion of people above a threshold of age, a certain age, not working in a paid or self-employment, but they are available for work during the period in question, the period you are studying. Okay, so to put it normal, unemployment is just that proportion of unemployed group is that proportion of people above certain age who are basically adults, not working in a paid employment or self-employment, but are available for work during the period of reference. Unemployment is a key indicator of the health of an economy. It helps to measure whether an economy is doing well or not. And that is why most government, the goal of most government is to ensure full employment. Okay, now when we say full employment is a concept, it doesn't mean everybody must be employed, but it's not of interest here, because at each point in time there are people who are moving from one job to the other, and so you may not totally classify them as unemployed group. So unemployment is measured by the unemployment rate, which is actually the number of people who are unemployed as a percentage of the labor force. Labor force are everybody who is qualified and available to work. That's the total number of people that are employed plus those that are not employed. That is the labor force. So unemployment rate is the proportion, is that percentage of people who are not employed among the labor force. The last concept of interest here is inflation and deflation. Inflation is basically a broad measure of the overall increase. Note it, overall increase in prices or the increase in the cost of living in a country. And that is why it's a macroeconomic issue. It has to do with overall increase. When a particular product is increasing, one product is increasing, you may not talk about inflation, okay, because that product may have alternative. But when it has to do with an aggregate increase, overall increase, then inflation comes to play. When the general price level increases, each unit of money buys fewer goods or services. As a result, inflation actually reduces the purchasing power of money. In economics, when you talk about deflation, it refers to the general price level, decrease in general price level of goods and services. Deflation happens when inflation rate falls to a point of zero. If it falls below zero, that is actually talking about negative inflation. So negative inflation is another name for deflection. But I need you to note that it is actually different when we talk about disinflation. Okay? This inflation reduces the value of money over time. Why deflation increases the value of money? Of course, deflation allows, for instance, you to buy more goods and services, with the same amount of money you have. So deflation is different from disinflation. Disinflation is slowed down in the inflation rates. When, for instance, inflation begins to decline, is declining, but there is still inflation, which means that inflation is positive, but is reducing in rate, is disinflation. Is different from de-inflation. De-inflation is why that thing is reducing, it gets to the point of 0% and goes below 0%, it becomes deflection. Whereas disinflation is when you start reducing the percentage of inflation, the inflation rate. Okay, this is basically where we're going to stop this discussion, hoping that these four concepts have been made clear to you: the concept of growth in economics, the concept of business cycle, the concept of unemployment, and the concept of inflation and deflation. On that note, I want to say a very big thank you for joining in this discussion. Hoping you will join us in the next discussion. If you appreciate this seminar, do subscribe. Thanks and God bless you. Cheers.